Okay, so 1994, right? Tonya Harding, Nancy Kerrigan. It was everywhere. Figure skating was the biggest thing on TV. I mean, everyone was talking about it. What really happened, who was right, who was wrong. It felt like the whole country was taking sides.
Yeah, it was a huge story, but
Yeah.
there's so much more to it than the headlines, you know?
Right, exactly.
Hmm.
We've got a ton of stuff here, articles and research, and even Tonya Harding's memoir.
Wow.
And we're going to dig into all of it in this deep dive, try to separate fact from fiction.
It's going to be fascinating. It's interesting because for as much as they were rivals, Tanya and Nancy actually had a lot in common. They
Yeah.
both came from working class families, and for both of them, skating, it wasn't just a hobby, it was a way out, you know?
Yeah.
A chance at a better life.
Yeah, absolutely, a path to a different life. And speaking of their backgrounds, Tanya was on the ice when she was just 3 years old.
Wow.
And by 4:30, every morning before school, I mean, talk about dedication.
That's incredible.
And Nancy's family, well, her dad actually drove the Zamboni at their local rink just so she could afford ice time.
Yeah. They both sacrificed a lot, their families too. You know, they poured everything into the sport. And for Tanya, all that work led to a really defining moment when she landed the triple axel.
Oh, yeah.
It was huge. Not a lot of women were doing that back then.
No, definitely not. Yeah. It took so much strength and precision. You have to have guts to even attempt a jump like that. It's amazing. We actually have the audio of when she landed it.
You can hear it in the crowd, that raw emotion. I mean, the power of that achievement.
Let's hear it.
Okay.
Wow, you can really feel the energy.
Yeah.
That jump, it made her a star.
Right? It really did. It set her apart from competitors like Nancy Kerrigan, for example, and Christy Yamaguchi.
Yeah.
But, you know, behind the scenes, things were very different for both of them. They both had to deal with abuse, but in totally different ways.
That's a good point. It's where the story takes a really dark turn, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Nancy, I mean, a lot of people remember the story of her mom. She was legally blind, and Nancy was seen as America's golden girl.
So much pressure.
Exactly. Huge pressure to be perfect, you know,
Yeah.
always in the spotlight.
Yeah.
And it's the complete opposite of what Tanya was dealing with. No one knew about the abuse she suffered from her mother first and then her husband, Jeff Gillooly.
Yeah, and reading about it in her memoir, it's really chilling. There was physical violence and psychological manipulation, just awful stuff. And you really start to understand how much all that abuse really affected her personality, you know, and how people saw her.
Oh, absolutely. And then there's the U.S. Figure Skating Association, the USFSA. They played a big role in both their lives. I mean, they controlled everything, like what the skaters wore, who they could date, all of it.
I mean, it's hard to believe, but they'd even critique Tanya's costumes and her makeup, even her teeth.
I know. A fan paid for her to have dental work because they said her teeth weren't good enough, quote unquote, unsuitable for a champion.
It's crazy how much emphasis they put on looking a certain way, you
Yeah.
know, like a very specific kind of femininity. And Tanya, I mean, she didn't fit into that mold.
No, she didn't. But it's interesting, though, because Nancy, she was kind of the perfect image, right? But she wasn't immune to the pressure.
Oh, of course not.
You were saying how one little comment she made, complaining about an appearance at Disney World, that actually hurt her perfect image.
It shows you how quickly things could change, you know? I mean,
Right.
these young women, they were under a microscope. Everyone expected them to be perfect on and off the ice. But there's another layer to all of this. There was a huge difference in how much money they made, Tanya and Nancy, that is.
That's something we talked about before we started recording, and I think it's really important for our listeners to hear this. Back then, there were all these rules about amateur athletes, like what endorsements they could get, and that had a massive impact on both of them, but in very different ways.
Yeah. So Nancy, she had all these big money endorsements.
But Tanya,
Tanya struggled.
I mean, Nancy had sponsors lining up, and Tanya, her biggest deal was a single commercial for Texaco.
It's a big contrast.
It really is.
And it shows how female athletes, even when they're at the top of their game, how undervalued they can be. But before we even get to the attack on Nancy and the media frenzy, we need to talk about what was happening in Tanya's life before that. I mean, things were really rough for her.
Yeah.
In 1993, the year before, she actually filed a restraining order against Jeff because of domestic violence.
Yeah.
And in her memoir, she talks about how bad the abuse was.
It's heartbreaking to read about her mother, her brother, and then Jeff. It's like this cycle of abuse that she couldn't escape. It makes you wonder how she could even function, let alone compete at such a high level with all that going on.
I know, it's incredible. She was incredibly resilient and determined.
For sure.
But it does raise some questions about the people who were supposed to be protecting her. Like, were there signs that people missed?
I think there were definitely red flags. Tanya's actually said that the USFSA pressured her to get back together with Jeff after their divorce.
Wow.
They thought he provided stability.
Yeah.
But knowing now about the abuse, it's really disturbing, right? Like, what were their priorities? Were they more worried about her image than keeping her safe?
Yeah, it makes you think. And remember, this was a time when people weren't really talking about domestic abuse. It
Wow.
wasn't something you saw on TV or read about in the papers.
Right.
And from what we've learned, it seems like they, the USFSA, might have missed how serious the situation really was, or maybe they just ignored it.
Awful to think about.
It is.
Okay, so let's talk about the attack on Nancy.
Yeah, that's the moment that changed everything. It happened just weeks before the Olympics in Lillehammer in Norway.
94, right?
Yeah, the 1994 Winter Olympics.
Yeah.
And the media, well, they just went crazy. Everyone wanted to know who was behind it.
Of course, yeah.
And it wasn't long before, suspicion fell on Tonya.
It seemed like everyone turned on her so quickly. I mean, one minute she's this tough competitor, the next she's public enemy number one.
The media definitely played a role in that, for sure. They already had this image of her,
Mhm.
this rough around the edges, kind of an outsider. And I think the attack just fit perfectly into that narrative.
Yeah, but wasn't it a lot more complicated than that? I mean, her ex-husband, Jeff Gillily, he was involved.
Yeah.
But how much did Tanya know? Was she really part of it?
That's the thing. We don't really know for sure. Most of the evidence against her, it was circumstantial.
Okay.
And it relied a lot on the testimony of people who were involved in the attack. And they were all trying to, get a better deal from the prosecution.
So it's like a movie, shady deals and betrayals and shifting alliances. I can't imagine how stressful that was for her. She was trying to deal with this legal nightmare and get ready for the Olympics at the same time.
Right. And the pressure from the USFSA, it was intense. They were threatening to ban her from competing
Wow.
completely.
But she didn't give up. She even hired that lawyer who was famous for representing celebrities. It seemed like she was determined to fight for her chance to compete.
Yeah, it was a bold move. And it worked, She ended up going to Lillehammer.
So they both end up at the Olympics, Tanya and Nancy, facing off on the world stage. I mean, the tension must have been incredible.
The media was loving it, of course. Every little look, every word, everything was analyzed. There's even footage of them practicing at the same rink. The cameras were everywhere. They were all over it.
It must have felt like the whole world was watching them, waiting for some kind of showdown.
Yeah, and the thing is, this rivalry, the media's obsession with it, it overshadowed everything. The whole point of the Olympics, this global event, it's supposed to be about athleticism and, coming together.
Right.
But it became all about this scandal and this drama.
So how did they do under all that pressure? I mean, how did they actually perform?
Nancy was amazing. She skated beautifully in the short program, and she ended up winning the silver medal.
She didn't win gold. I thought she was the favorite going in.
She was, but she lost to Oksana Beul from Ukraine. It was a really controversial decision.
Really? What happened? Was there some problem with the judging?
The scores were really, really close, and some people thought Nancy should have won. There were rumors that maybe one of the judges accidentally entered the wrong score.
Wow.
Those things do happen, and it can have a huge impact, especially in a sport like figure skating where the margins are so small.
So even winning silver came with a lot of drama.
Right.
What about Tanya? How did she deal with everything that was going on?
She had a much harder time. She finished 10th in the short program, and then in the long program, well, disaster struck.
Oh no, what happened?
Her skate lace broke.
Are you serious?
It was chaos. She stopped her routine and was pleading with the judges for a minute to fix it.
Oh man.
Yeah.
Imagine that. Trading your whole life for that one moment and then your lace breaks.
It was heartbreaking. You could see it on her face. But to her credit, she pulled herself together, got the lace fixed, and finished her program. But of course, her score suffered.
It must have been devastating. Talk about resilience, though. I mean,
Yeah.
to keep going after all of that, that's incredible. So what happened after the Olympics? Did things calm down? Did the media finally move on?
Not at all. The scandal just kept getting bigger. It was like
Yeah.
everyone was trying to cash in.
Uh-huh.
There were books and documentaries. And Tonya, she was just constantly being scrutinized and criticized.
It's like everyone was profiting from her misfortune.
That's a good point. And I think it's important to remember, Tonya, she was incredibly talented, but she became this cautionary tale
Yeah.
about how quickly fame can disappear.
But her life wasn't a fairy tale even before all of this happened. Even before the attack on Nancy, we talked about the abuse she suffered. We can't forget about that.
Absolutely. I mean, Tonya was a victim long before this whole scandal. Poverty, neglect, violence, her mother, her brother, her husband. It's just this awful pattern.
It really is.
This cycle of abuse.
And it's important to remember that all of that trauma shaped her, and how she made decisions. It even affected how she came across to people. The media, they always portrayed her as this volatile, unpredictable person.
Yeah.
But those weren't personality flaws.
Right.
I mean, they were a direct result of the abuse.
Absolutely. You can't just separate someone's actions from their experiences. There's always a deeper story there.
A human story, right?
Exactly, behind all the headlines. And in Tanya's case, I think it's a story of resilience. It's about fighting for what you want, even when the odds are stacked against you. It's both inspiring and tragic.
It really is. So what happened after the Olympics? Did she keep skating?
Unfortunately, no. The USFSA, they banned her from amateur figure skating for life. So that was the end of her competitive career.
Wow.
Yeah, she tried different things, to make a living. Professional wrestling, boxing. She even tried a music career for a bit.
Yeah.
But it seemed like the scandal followed her. It always overshadowed her accomplishments. That's so sad. I mean, she had so much potential. What about Nancy? Did she keep skating?
She did. She had a successful professional career, and she stayed out of the limelight for the most part, got married, had kids, and seemed to move on, at least publicly.
Sounds like she was able to find some peace. Get back to a normal life after all of that.
Yeah, to a certain extent. But we can't forget, she was also a victim in all this. I mean, she was attacked, and her Olympic dreams were almost taken away from her.
It's easy to forget that with all the hype and the drama surrounding it all.
Right. We tend to focus on the rivalry, the scandal, but we forget about the human cost.
Yeah.
I mean, they both paid a price for what happened.
Yeah, no, you're right. That's a good point. So as we're wrapping up this part of our deep dive, what can we learn from all of this? What's the takeaway here for our listeners? What should they be thinking about? Well, I think it's a cautionary tale about a lot of things, the dangers of ambition, the pressure of fame, and how much power the media has. But it also reminds us to be more compassionate, to be more understanding, and to try to look beyond the headlines and see the real people behind them.
It's amazing, isn't it? This whole Tonya Harding, Nancy Kerrigan thing, it still fascinates people. Like, even after all these years, it's like a modern-day Greek tragedy or something.
It really is. And what's interesting is how our view of this whole story has changed over time.
Yeah.
Especially with social media and everything. There's been a lot of talk about women's stories from the 90s. And you can really see a shift in how people see Tonya now.
Yeah, I think there's definitely more empathy for her now. People are starting to understand what she went through a little bit better.
Right. They see that she was a product of her environment, a victim of abuse and all those societal pressures. The villain image. That's starting to fade, and people are seeing her as a more complex person, someone you can actually sympathize with.
And let's not forget what she accomplished on the ice. That triple axel. That was incredible.
Oh, yeah.
It seems like that's finally getting the recognition it deserves.
Absolutely. It's become a symbol of her strength, her determination, her refusal to give up.
It's powerful.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how time can change our perspective on things. We could look back and see things in a whole new light.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to keep revisiting these stories, to challenge the way we think about things. The Harding-Kerrigan saga, it's not just some tabloid story from the past. It tells us a lot about our culture, our values, our obsession with fame and scandal. And it shows how our understanding of things like gender and class and abuse has evolved.
Yeah, you're right. It really makes you think. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the big takeaways here? What do we learn from exploring these two women's lives?
I think the most important thing is empathy. We have to see the humanity in everyone, even people we might judge too quickly. Tonya, she wasn't perfect, but she was an amazing athlete. And she overcame incredible challenges in her life.
And she was a victim, a survivor. It reminds us that there's always more to the story than we see on the surface. We can't judge people just based on their actions, not without understanding where they come from, what they've been through.
Exactly. And as consumers of media, we need to be more discerning, more critical, but also more compassionate in how we interpret these stories.
Yeah, we can't just take the headlines at face value, right? We have to dig deeper, look for the nuances, and try to see the bigger picture.
Right, because these stories, they're entertaining, but they have real consequences for the people involved.
That's true. I think we've uncovered a lot in this deep dive. We went beyond the sensationalism, the headlines, and looked at the human side of all of this.
I hope so. And I hope this encourages everyone to think critically about the stories we tell ourselves, the narratives we embrace. We all have the power to shape perceptions.
That's true. It's a big responsibility to be more thoughtful, more informed, and more empathetic. Because sometimes the most important stories, they're the ones that make us question everything we thought we knew. That's a great place to end it. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure.